And so I've heard the skeptics say, well, why didn't God just go ahead and ban slavery? He did. This right here is that type of slavery that was happening during the 1700s, 1800s, and even still continues to happen today. God has directly banned that altogether.
Hello and welcome to Reasoning Through the Bible. My name is Glenn and this is Steve. And this is part 2 of a topical series we're doing on slavery in the Bible. And what prompted this was in our regular Bible study, we had gotten to Exodus chapter 21, and that deals with several things about slavery. And also in dealing with this, there's a lot of questions and comments, and there's a lot of sensitivity around the issue of slavery because there was so much pain. And we recognize that. If you were with our part 1, we went into quite a bit of detail about all the different types of slavery in the ancient world and how it was used. And just to reiterate here, though, Steve, is that we find the issue of slavery not to be taken lightly. We certainly don't want to be accused of trying to just gloss over or pass over something that's a very serious sin.
Right. Well, and whenever you go through the scriptures verse by verse, when you get to these type of verses, you have to deal with them. You have to go through them. And I encourage, go and listen to verse part 1 before you listen to this part 2, because it puts a lot of things and explanations in some of the terms that we're going to be using in part 2.
So most of these passages that we're going to deal with today are in the Old Testament, specifically in Leviticus and Numbers and Exodus. And those passages are in a section of the scriptures that, again, you have to know where it is and what's going on. This is with the people of Israel just prior to when they went into the promised land, the land of Canaan. And there was going to be wars with the Canaanites, and the Canaanites were a very evil people. They were frying their children on the heated metal arms of an idol called Molech. And God had sent them prophets, and the people of Canaan had refused to repent and change their ways. And so God was sending Israel in as judgment. That's the context of what was going on, is that there was a lot of evil going on. And he was giving Israel instructions. The Mosaic Law is a set of instructions for when Israel gets to the Promised Land. And the Mosaic Law includes parts of Exodus, parts of Numbers, and all of Deuteronomy and Leviticus. And so there's a vast swath of the scriptures, approximately 3 books, that deal with all of these rules and regulations and things. And so we're going to today, again, we said last time we'd get to the passages and hit them right between the eyes. So we're going to do that today. We're going to start in Leviticus chapter 24 and deal with part of what's going on here when we talk about the Mosaic Law. And we can say with confidence here that there's a lot of high morality in the Mosaic Law. And this is one of the passages. And this one that we're going to read here really covers something that is a foundation for all of what we do. And Steve, can you read here in Leviticus 24, start at verse 17 and go down to 22?
If a man takes the life of any human being, he shall surely be put to death. The one who takes the life of an animal shall make it good, life for life. If a man injures his neighbor, just as he does done, so it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, just as he has injured a man, so shall it be inflicted on him. Thus the one who kills an animal shall make it good, but the one who kills a man shall be put to death. There shall be one standard for you. It shall be for the stranger as well as the native, for I am the Lord your God.
So that passage right there, of course, is a somewhat famous eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth passage, which is actually mentioned more than once, Steve, in the scriptures. Mm-hmm. But it says here very clearly, again, point this out, verse 17, if a man takes the life of any human being. So if someone causes the death, in this case, murder of anyone, whether it's slave or free, then they have to be punished for that. And so the context here is any human being. And so then look down at verse 22. Verse 22 says specifically what? There shall be one standard for you. It shall be for the stranger as well as the native, for I am the Lord your God. So, Steve, what is that saying when it says one standard for you? And we just said in the context of that same paragraph, any human being.
Right.
So the entirety of these 2 or 3 books of the Mosaic Law have to be applied to people how?
The same for everybody in regards to this. But now, as we've mentioned before, if you broke one of these laws, you broke the whole law itself. And as we've also brought out before, that the law, it wasn't just for practicality as they went into the land, but it was also a tutor to show in the greater context that mankind wasn't going to be able to keep all of these laws. At some point in time, they were going to break one or the other, and that they were going to have some sort of a redemption in order to have a relationship with God. And of course, that came through Jesus Christ through the sacrifice. But in general, if you broke one of these laws, you broke everything. This is very clear. If you take the life of any human being, whether it's a stranger or a native, meaning an Israelite, then you're to be put to death.
And as you've highlighted there, Steve, in verse 22, there shall be one standard. It says literally judgment. There's one judgment for all people, whether they be citizens, slave, free, strangers. The law has to be applied. All of these 600 plus rules have to be applied equally. And go back up to verse 17. And just to point out, just so people don't forget, if a man takes the life of any human being, down at verse 19, if a man injures his neighbor, well, his neighbor is going to include bond slaves, free people, strangers. It's any human being. So again, verse 19, if a man injures his neighbor, so it shall be done for him. To do what? Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And the same language is going to appear over in Exodus 21. And what it's saying there is you really can't go out and abuse people, anyone, whether they be slave or free. You can't just go injure people. If you do, you take them to the judges, and the judges are going to say, if we take this just flat out literally, the same thing has to happen to you. Now, personally, if I were a judge, I would have a hard time saying, okay, you got in a fight and poked this guy eyes out, so we're going to go poke your eye out. The point of it's clear.
Right.
It has to be equal. And it has to be equal for everybody, including bond slaves.
Well, and I think the recompense here is the recompense has to be equal. I mean, if you put somebody else's eye out, you're risking putting them to death. If you chop off their hand or something like that, if that was the penalty, eye for an eye type of thing, you risk having them die because of bleeding to death and stuff. So I think in general, here in regards to some of these other ones, at least it's a recompense that is equal to whatever the offense was. And the word here that's also used in chapter 19, when it says injured, it says literally give a blemish. And in part 1, you had mentioned about that there were rules that even down to the bruises that were given. This is one of those, this is that situation here. Even if they would give a bruise or something, there was supposed to be some sort of a recompense or repayment.
Yes. So you can't just go out and injure people. Our friends, the skeptics and the atheists, get a lot of mileage out of where we're going next, which is Exodus 21, is going to be saying, oh, you can just go out and as long as you don't murder them, you can abuse the slave, beat them half to death. Well, no. The Mosaic Law is very clear. If you injure anyone, whether they be slave or free, then you go before a judge and they say this punishment has to be equal. Just because somebody owes you money and you have them under a bond obligation doesn't mean I can go beat them up. And that passage we just read said that.
And the other point in regards to that there's one judgment for everyone, what that also means is that class doesn't come into it. In other words, Just because you might be a rich person that has property, whether it's flocks or something else like that, no, you're also going to be judged as well. So again, this is in relation to other nations that were around where people of class, upper class, they weren't under the same judgment. There were two different types of judgment. If you were in the part that was part of the royalty, or if you were part of the part that had money or wealth, you might be able to injure other people and never have to pay for it. No, this is saying is it doesn't matter. There's one judgment for everybody. Doesn't matter whether it's the stranger, the class, anything else like that. There's going to have to be a judgment made on it. And
most cultures in most days have different sets of standards for the wealthy and the poor people. And God here is saying, no, everybody will be treated the same. Now, over in Exodus 21, Steve, read the first four verses of Exodus 21, because this whole chapter has a fair amount of info here on slavery.
Now, these are the ordinances which you are to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone.
So, with that, it says there in the first part, if you buy a Hebrew slave, right? It says right there in verse 2, if you buy a Hebrew slave. So our friends that make the accusations against the Bible get a lot of mileage right there. Doesn't it say buy a Hebrew slave? Again, we just spent a whole session last time talking about all the various reasons why there would be a monetary exchange there for a bond slave. People owe money, various other reasons, and we spent a whole session on that.
So in this case, just real briefly, so in this case, it might be where it says, if you buy, it might be the case of just one example of where the person needs to give a repayment. And so they're going to that person and saying, I'm going to go work for you in order to pay this back. It's termed here buying, but in essence, it's that person saying, I'm going to repay the debt that I owe you by going into a servitude to you.
Oh, yes. Or if in the case of, like we showed in Genesis or different places, if people are starving to death,
yeah,
and they're wanting to sell themselves in order to get food, then it lays out limits on that.
But the point being here is there's not a slave market somewhere where they're going out and say, honey, I think I'm going to go down to the slave market and buy me a slave today. That's not what this is talking about.
Correct. That's not the case. And it says in verse 2, on the 7th year, he shall go out as a free man without payment. In the 7th year, he shall go out as a free man. They were bond slaves because they owed a debt. Right. He will go out even if the amount of the debt was more than you think 7 years of labor was, you still have to let him go. Right? So yes, the debt will get paid up to 6 years. On the 7th year, you had to let him go. And so what you can't do is say, oh, you owe me, you owe me, you owe me. And so again, that would limit the amount of money that a lender was going to loan to someone, because they're not going to loan anymore. Then I can get 7 years of labor back out of this person.
Right.
And so that puts very humane limits on this whole idea of this bond slave idea of having this obligation where somebody owns my time.
And the point there at the last part of 2 where it says without payment is talking about, okay, well, he might not have worked off his debt. Whenever he's let free, he can't go and say, oh, but you need to pay me. Well, no, you haven't finished. You're actually haven't even worked off all your debt. I'm legally bound to let you go, but I'm not going to pay you in order for thinking you still owe me money. So that's what that second part there is dealing with as well.
Right. So God is putting humane limits on these obligations. The person loaning the money still gets their money, but he's going to say, okay, you can't abuse this to where, human nature being what it is, where people would take advantage of it.
And the person that owes the debt can't abuse it either.
Right. And you know what it reminds me of, Steve? Over in Proverbs, chapter 22, verse 7, it is a verse that we've all thrown around. The borrower is the slave of the lender. Borrower is the slave of the lender. Now, you and I, when we think of that, we think in terms of just, okay, they're the slave in a figurative sense. And I submit that that's what really happens, really, is that it's not a figurative statement. When you borrowed money in those days, you became the slave of the lender because they could exact the money from you, that you will pay it back. But again, God is so humane here in this section that he puts limits on it. Now, in verse 4, it talks there about if the wife was owned by the master and the 7 years are up for him but not for her, she has to wait for the 7 years.
Right.
Right. So that's the point here, is that it's not saying that, oh, this woman is the permanent property. No, because she's under the same rule. We read that a while ago, right? Everybody has to be treated the same. And so she has the 7-year obligation as well. And you can't morally say, oh, I got married and we had kids, so I don't have to pay my debt back. No, she has to stay and work her debt off too. Just because she gets married and has kids, you can't say that the debt's forgiven. So what it's saying there in that passage, if somebody's 7 years are up and they've fallen in love and they've married someone and had children, then the man has to wait until the lady has the 7-year obligation up because she owed hers too. It's not saying that, oh, you're just, the owner's going to go sell her for a profit. That's not what that's saying.
Right. And it's also in verse 4 there, if the master gives him a wife. In other words, it's also while he's there working off this debt, this is a situation where he has the ability to be married and ability to have a family and children as well. And there's other parts that we're going to read here in a little bit that he has options as well at this particular point in time, whether to stay or whether to leave. And now that he's got a family and a wife.
And this is why we spent so much time last time with this whole idea of the debtor and the bond slave. It is immoral, at least in this day, the people's mind. It is immoral not to pay the debt back because people will come up with excuses. Oh, I went broke, et cetera, et cetera. I don't owe the money anymore, and we allow that. And to their mind, they'd say this, how could you let somebody get out without paying their debt? That's immoral. And so that's what's going on here. It's not saying it's permanently gone. It's just saying it has to hang around until she's worked off her 7 years. Now, the next one, starting at verse 7 and going down to 11. Steve, could you read those verses?
If a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he will not do these 3 things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money.
So what undergirds all of this, and one of the reasons we spent so much time last time, is because the context here and all the other laws are vastly important. First passage we read, all the punishments for murder, kidnapping, cursing of parents, assault, causing someone to lose work time, all those laws have to be treated the same for every human. That undergirds all of these things that, like this passage in Exodus 21. In this case, this man sells a daughter. Now, on just the face of it, my modern mind looks at that and says, how horrendous could you get if a father sold a daughter? But what did we see last time? Multiple reasons why that might be the case, some of which might be what?
Well, starvation. Feed your family. You can't feed your children. So it might be a case where he's putting his daughter into servitude to be taken care of.
And also in here, if you just look at the passage, they're talking about getting married. They're talking about getting married here. So I look at bride price as saying this is awful, you're selling a human being. Many cultures don't. Many cultures say this is a normal, expected thing for money to change hands at the point when a man gives up his daughter to get married.
Well, and then also, as it says there in verse 7, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. So that's one thing that the skeptics pick up on too. Oh, she's different than the man. No, if you go and read it, there's actually rights that are going to be given to her. In other words, if he's there and the man that she's going to doesn't want to marry her, or the son says doesn't want to marry her, what it's saying is you just can't put her out as you do a male. No, you can't do that. I mean, you can't take her and sell her to somebody else. She's not property is really what it's saying.
Right.
You have to treat her differently and in a better way than you would a male is actually what this is saying.
Yes. And yes, it's better. Look at verse 7 again. If a man sells his daughter as a female ebed, and we made a big deal last time about this term ebed, has a variety of meanings. Our translators here in the New American Standard translated it slave, but hundreds of times that's used as servant, it's used as a bond servant, it's used in a variety of meanings. And so in this case, marriage arrangements weren't done the same way as what we have as this Prince Charming, fall in love with somebody. Marriages were done in different ways. And all this is saying is that if there's an arrangement where a man is giving his daughter to somebody else, it talks about conjugal rights in there. It gives limits to what can happen. It's rather obviously a marriage arrangement. And what it's saying is if there's this instance where and money has changed hands with the bride price, then husband can't take advantage of her. And then if he does, decides that, look at verse 10, if he takes another wife, and many of the translations translate that wife, this one says woman, if he takes another woman or wife, he may not reduce her food, clothing. It's a list of protection there. Modern eye, especially from our country, looks at this with a sexual atmosphere around it, and that's not the case in everywhere. They were taking care of the daughter and the wife. This is not a sex slave kind of an arrangement. This was a husband taking a wife.
Well, and also in verse 8 there it says if they're displeasing to the eyes, her master who designated. In other words, if this was the arrangement, if he goes, no, you know what, I don't want to no longer marry her, or I don't want my son to, there's a provision in here that she can be redeemed back by the family, specifically so that she's not sold to somebody else. Again, just like what you were saying, if a person owed a debt, it was immoral if they didn't pay the debt. No, you got to pay the debt. Well, it's similar here. No, you have this arrangement in order to marry this woman. Just because you don't find her attractive, or because of some reason you come up with she doesn't cook right or whatever it might be, you can just do whatever you want to with her now. No, she can be redeemed back by her family.
And again, look at verse 8. He shall let her be redeemed.
Yeah.
Which means he has to let her be taken back by the family.
By the family.
And so that's what it's talking about. And of course, if you're a skeptic or an atheist and you're just looking for ammo to tear down the Bible and you don't want to look at these nuances and you just turn to this and say, oh, selling a daughter, how horrible. No, there's a lot more to it than that. They're taking care of these people. That's the point here. So he has to treat her well. That's what it's saying here. And then in verse 9, he has to treat her, it says, according to the custom of daughters. According to the custom of daughters is what it says in verse 9. Now, that is another one of these things that's, you have to know the context. That phrase, according to the custom of daughters, is a technical legal term that the scholars tell us. It's a phrase that legally means he must treat her like a freeborn person, with all rights of citizenship. Again, look at verse 9. He must deal with her according to the custom of daughters. And again, don't take my word for it. You can look these up, do the research. The Nuzi letters, N-U-Z-I, an archaeological find from the Nuzi site in northern Iraq, laid out what that phrase means and what it meant. So what it's saying is that if you have this woman and there's some sort of an issue, disagreement, you have to treat her like a free woman. And you have to let her be bought back. She has rights. You can't sell her like a piece of property. That's what it's saying. But again, if you're a skeptic or an atheist and are only looking for something to use against the Bible and don't spend the time to do the research, then you can turn this into something that it's not. That's what really kind of gets under my skin is they take these passages that specifically laid out to be moral, taking care of a woman, and they turn them into something just polar opposite. Modern Western society is drowning in rampant sexual immorality. And so the skeptics see this and they immediately think sex slaves. And nothing could be further from the truth. These protections are for families that were starving to death and really didn't have any other options. I personally met people that their parents were so impoverished that they had to let their children go. In our case, it was in our country, they gave them away to orphanages because they just couldn't feed them. But in those days, they didn't have orphanages. They had these kind of things. So they would have to do a bride price exchange for money, these kind of things. So with that, any comments before we move on to verse 16?
Nope.
Okay, so verse 16 talks about what we would normally think of as the cause for slavery. So Exodus 21:16 says, "He who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death." Now, with that one verse, he who kidnaps, or as we've shown here, the translators say, steal a man, whether he sells him or just has him in his possession, shall put to death. So, Steve, what does that do to our modern framework that, as we showed in the first session, our framework is sort of people being kidnapped and sold on a slave market? And what does that do to that whole idea?
Well, the first thing that comes out of this is this brings up the 8th commandment, you shall not steal. It includes not stealing other people, not kidnapping other people. And so I've heard the skeptics say, well, why didn't God just go ahead and ban slavery? He did. This right here is that type of slavery that was happening during the 1700s, 1800s, and even still continues to happen today. God has directly banned that altogether. And so it's a very direct, there's no getting around it. You're not supposed to steal other people and to turn them into slaves and sell them as slaves.
Right. And so that's what it's saying is flat out, we can't have a slave market. And we'll get into later, there's passages and we'll get to these where it says if a slave escapes, you can't send them back. And so that's something else that we'll get to momentarily.
And the penalty too. What's the penalty? The penalty is put to death. There's capital punishment for people that are actually stealing other people and putting them in and selling them.
Right. So it prevents chattel slavery, which is the slavery that we think of. This whole section in Exodus 21, starting at verse 12 and going down through about verse 36, it has all the same laws that undergird. That's why we made such a big point before, is all the laws have to be applied equally to everyone. You can't have certain laws for certain people, certain laws for slaves, and different than other people, where some people get taken advantage of. Yeah, there's passages like the one we just read that say you can't take advantage of women, but it's because they're more vulnerable. And so all the laws, this whole section assumes that those passages we read earlier applies, which is everybody, bond or free, slave or not, have to be treated equally. And the The bond slaves were not to be abused. The whole rest of the law, the slaves had to rest on the Sabbath. They had to be part of the feast days, Deuteronomy chapter 16. Deuteronomy 16 tells you, you will have a feast. You're going to go and have fun whether you like it or not. And you're going to take all the servants and all the strangers, and you will go out, and everybody's going to have a party, and you're going to treat everybody, because everybody's going to have a feast day. And so all the feast days throughout the year, the bond slaves had to go, the strangers and the aliens had to go. They all had to rest. All the laws apply equally. The law had to apply to them just the same as to free citizens. The reason I say that is because the next section, starting in verse 18, is really where the crux of a lot of these accusations about slavery come in. So, Steve, if you could start at 18 and read through 21.
If men have a quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die but remains in bed, if he gets up and walks around outside on his staff, then he who struck him shall go unpunished. He shall only pay for his loss of time and shall take care of him until he is completely healed. If a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and he dies at his hands, he shall be punished. If, however, he survives a day or two, no vengeance shall be taken, for he is his property.
Okay, so in that, verse 18 and 19, notice that the punishment is the same for all people. Look back at verse 18. If men have a quarrel. Okay, so who does that include, Steve?
If they're fighting everybody.
Does that include slaves?
Yes.
Okay, read it again.
Yeah.
If men have a quarrel, that includes slaves, it includes free people. All those passages we read earlier, all the laws have to apply to everybody equally. If any two men have a quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die but remains in bed, what that means is he got hurt and he can't work. So if they get in a fight and one of them gets hurt and the other one can't work, he has to stay in bed. This is dealing with any two people and one of them gets hurt and they can't work.
Well, the injury is to the extent that it makes him bedridden.
It makes him bedridden.
And you're going to get to it here in just a second. The next injury is if it's an injury to where he's not bedridden and he's still able to stand up and still be able to walk around, which is a lesser injury than if one that is actually bedridden somebody where they can't work or do anything for however many days it might be.
Right. And so then look at the consequences. So all what we just read was the if. Look at the end of verse 19. If somebody gets hurt and they have to stay in bed, there's two things he has to do. He shall take care of him until he is completely healed. And just prior to that, he shall pay for his loss of time. So if somebody gets hurt, they get in a fight, any two men, bonders or free, citizen or not, they get in a fight, one of them gets injured to the point they're in bed and they can't work. They're injured and they're in bed. Then the person that caused the injury has to pay for their loss of time and their care, which means their medical care. So we don't miss this. Into verse 19, he shall only pay for his loss of time and shall take care of him until he is completely healed. So the context here is, I'm belaboring this for a reason. Somebody got hurt, they're bedridden, they got hurt enough to where they can't go up and go back to work. The person that caused that has to pay for the loss of time, pay for the medical expenses.
And take care of him,
To take care of him.
until he's healed.
That is the context for the next two verses, which are the ones that always get brought up about the specifics on the slave. So verses 20 to 22. If a man strikes his male or female slave, and again, it's an ebed, his servant, could be bond slave, whatever. If a man strikes his male or female bond slave with a rod and he dies at his hand, he shall be punished. However, if he survives a day or two, this is the bond slave, no vengeance shall be taken, for he is his property. And that's the one that everybody gets all wrapped around the axle over. Now, the word property there is Strong's 3701, and it literally means silver. The word is kesef. It means silver. It's his money, as some of the translations say. Why would he say that? The reason is because the point I just belabored a minute ago. What did any two men, including a slave, one of them gets injured, what were the two things they had to pay for? He had to pay for what? The loss of his time and his medical care.
Right.
But if it's a slave from the owner, how are you going to pay for his time? Because you just cost yourself the money. The slave, the bond slave, owed you money. That's why he was there. He was under the bond. He owed you money.
Right.
And you caused him not to be able to work. How are you going to pay for yourself? How are you going to pay a fine to yourself for his loss of time? And so that's what that means in verse 21. However, if he survives a day or two, no vengeance, no penalty shall be taken, for he is his money. He's the money of the owner.
Right.
And so it just gets me frustrated, because what this is really doing is the text just said that if you do anything enough to hurt somebody, enough to where they lose work, then you have to pay for their time and pay for their medical expenses. We'd call it workman's compensation. You got to pay for that. That's anybody, even a slave. But if it's somebody you own, you don't have to pay yourself. That's all it's saying. And the skeptics take this and run with it and make it something bad and make it, oh, you can beat them half to death. I've heard some of these atheists and skeptics say, oh, you can break their legs, you can pound them with whatever you want, as long as they don't die, you can do whatever you want because they're a piece of farm equipment. No, you're taking something out of context. You're taking one sentence, one phrase, and using it in a way that the text of the Bible just doesn't say. It just said you have to take care of them. And we belabored the point. All of these passages, you have to treat everybody the same. And if you did strike him enough to where he's in bed for 2 or 3 days, he can go to the judges,
right,
and say, he bruised me, he injured me. And if it's, as we're going to get to, if it's enough to where he actually is maiming, you have to let him free. Or if it's just even a bruise, the judge says, okay, same thing got to happen to you.
Now, the other thing to bring out here is that the skeptics, what you just said there is that, oh, they could beat them, they could maim them, they could do whatever they wanted to. No, that's not what this is saying. In any society, at any given point in time, you have people that are cruel people. This is talking about somebody who happens to mistreat somebody else. This is how it's going to be dealt with. It's not saying and giving them permission to mistreat people or be cruel to people. This is not given anything such shape or form as to that. It's just saying is that for those people that if they happen to have this happen or have a quarrel between whether it's even slaves or free people or whatever it might be, here's the conditions of how it needs to be dealt with.
The closest you could say to that, look at verse 21. If he survives a day or two, no vengeance shall be taken. Or some of the translations say he shall not be punished. The accusation from the people just attempting to tear down the Bible is that right there in verse 21, no punishment shall be taken. And I submit it's in the context of 18 to 21. It's in the context of no punishment shall be taken because he's your money. Read the sentence. No punishment shall be taken for he is his money. How are you gonna, he just said that if it's anybody else, you got to pay for their time.
Yeah.
But if it's your bondservant, no punishment because he's your money. That's what he's saying. He's not saying you can beat him half to death. That's not what it's saying. Right. It doesn't say that. It doesn't mean that. And twisting it to say that is either an intentional twisting of the scriptures because they're looking for something to tear down the Bible, or they didn't take the time to just do the research, or they're lying, or all of those. Because what this is really doing is a moral protection of people that were under a legal obligation. because they borrowed money and then owed it back, and they're having to spend their time working for somebody to work off a debt. And it's saying you can't abuse these people, and twisting that to saying that, oh, this is chattel slavery, piece of farm equipment that you can just buy and slave and buy and sell and beat them up whenever you want. No, it's saying exactly the opposite. And it just frustrates me. Again, the word property, Strong's 3701. And remember, this bond slave made this agreement to pay something back. And that's why they're there in the first place. Just to repeat, because this keeps going, Leviticus 24, verse 17 to 22 says that if you injure anyone, including bruises, including slaves, you will be punished with the same punishment. All of that undergirds this passage that we just read. Now, go down to verse 26 in this passage, says that bond slaves can't be mistreated. That's what it's saying, starting in verse 26. That's one more of the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth part, right? It says that if bond slaves cannot be mistreated, and if you do, it has to be, I mean, look at verse 27. If he knocks out a tooth of his male or female slave, he shall let him go free on account of his tooth. Now, the same thing the judges would apply is, okay, he tore up my knee,
Right.
right, or any other body part.
Right.
Then the same thing would apply, right?
Yeah. So these are actually acting as deterrents. It's actually laying things out so that these people that have put themselves in a voluntary servitude to repay a debt, these particular prescriptions that are put here, these laws that are put here, rules, are there as deterrents so that the person will not abuse them. Hey, if you're going to abuse this person and beat this person, guess what? They're going to go free. If you have some type of an injury or that maims them or something, they're going to go free. And so just because they have put themselves in this position of as a bond slave, a bond servant, servitude in order to repay a debt does not give you license to go out and treat them however you want to, or mistreat them however you want to.
Right. And verse 21 does not override verses 23 to 25. Verses 23 to 25 is the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Can't abuse them. If you do, you got to set them free. And so verse 21 is in the context of Leviticus 24, and it's in the context of verses 24, 25, 26, 27 that deal with treating people fairly. And so you can't take one little phrase and rip it from its context and make it say something else. And Steve, we're gone a little long, and we still got a fair amount to do. So I think we're going to end up with a part 3. And so with that, we'll probably pause here because there's still a couple of real good passages and some stuff in the New Testament, and there's some application for even our salvation. And so we want to get to those. So there's a lot here. We're taking our time to try to get it carefully and explain it right. Any last words before we go?
I just thank everyone for watching and listening, and may God bless you.